The morning air held a bite of autumn as Thomas Chen stood outside the grand concert hall, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He took a deep breath and looked up at the stone building with its tall windows reflecting the early sunlight. The Westfield Symphony Orchestra, home to some of the finest musicians in the country, was about to become his workplace. At least that was the plan. Thomas ran his fingers through his dark hair, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. 6 weeks ago, he had been teaching piano to children in his small hometown. Today, he was about to join one of the most respected orchestras in the nation after winning a blind audition that had drawn over 200 applicants. "You belong here," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd developed during the countless hours spent practicing alone. They chose you because of what they heard, not what they saw. He climbed the wide steps and pulled open the heavy door. The lobby smelled of polished wood and history. Following the directions he'd received by email, Thomas made his way toward the rehearsal hall, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. As he approached the double doors, the sound of instruments tuning filtered through, violins adjusting their pitch, a clarinet running through scales, the distant boom of timpani being tested. Thomas paused, hand on the door handle, and closed his eyes for a moment to let the sounds wash over him. This was the world he had dreamed of entering since he was 8 years old. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The rehearsal hall was larger than he had imagined, with high ceilings and walls designed to capture sound. About 60 musicians sat in a semicircle, their attention focused on a tall man standing on a podium at the front. This had to be Anton Harrington, the conductor whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by stories of his fierce temper. Thomas slipped into the room as quietly as possible, but Harrington's head snapped up immediately. The conductor's piercing blue eyes locked onto him and the room fell silent. "You must be Chen," Harrington said, his voice carrying easily across the hall without seeming to raise it. "You're 3 minutes late." "I'm sorry, sir," Thomas replied, feeling heat rise to his face. "I wanted to make sure I found the right." "When rehearsal begins at 9, Harrington cut him off, tapping his baton against his palm. "It means everyone is seated, warmed up, and ready to play at 9. Not walking through the door at 9. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, swallowing hard. A woman with silver-streaked hair who sat in the first violin section gave Thomas a sympathetic smile. "The piano is there," she whispered, nodding toward the grand piano positioned to the right of the conductor's podium. Thomas nodded his thanks and made his way to the instrument. It was a magnificent Steinway concert grand, its black surface gleaming under the rehearsal lights. As he set his backpack down and took his seat, he felt dozens of curious eyes on him. He was the newcomer, the unknown, the one who had somehow earned a spot in their prestigious circle. "Now that we're all present," Harrington said with a pointed look at Thomas, "let's begin with the Beethoven. Symphony No. 7, second movement." The rehearsal began, and Thomas followed along with his part. The piano wasn't featured prominently in this section, but he stayed alert, counting measures and waiting for his entrance. When his moment came, he played the simple accompanying passage with care, making sure his timing matched perfectly with the string section. For a while, it seemed to be going well. The orchestra moved through the piece with the practiced ease of musicians who had played together for years. Thomas began to relax slightly, letting himself enjoy the way the music flowed around him. Then Harrington stopped abruptly, raising his baton. "Hold," he called out, and the music screeched to a halt. The sudden silence felt heavy. "Piano," he said, turning to Thomas. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Thomas blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry." "That passage," Harrington said, pointing to the score with his baton. "You're playing it like you're at a student recital. This is Beethoven, not a lullaby. Where's the depth? Where's the connection to what the strings are doing?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I thought I was following." "Following isn't enough," Harrington interrupted. "Anyone can follow. I need musicians who understand. Let's try it again, from measure 42. Thomas nodded, his fingers suddenly feeling stiff and uncooperative. He focused on the music, trying to hear what Harrington wanted. When they reached his part again, he played with more emphasis, trying to match the emotional quality of the string section, but Harrington stopped them again. No, he said, shaking his head in frustration. "Now you're overplaying. It's like you're trying to be a soloist in a piece where you're meant to be the foundation. He sighed heavily and turned to face the entire orchestra. Let's take 10 minutes. When we return, we'll move to the Rachmaninoff. As the musicians set down their instruments and began to stand, Harrington turned back to Thomas. Chen, stay a moment. The other musicians filed out, some casting curious glances back at Thomas. The silver-haired violinist gave him an encouraging nod as she passed. When the hall had emptied except for the two of them, Harrington stepped down from his podium and approached the piano. Your audition recording was exceptional, Harrington said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. I fought to have you here because I heard something rare, but this morning I'm not hearing it. I'm nervous, Thomas admitted. It's my first day and I want to make a good impression. Harrington's expression remained stern, but something in his eyes softened slightly. Nerves are normal, but in this orchestra, we don't have time for extended adjustment periods. Every rehearsal matters. He ran his hand along the edge of the piano with a tenderness that contrasted with his harsh words. This instrument has been with me for 15 years. I selected it personally from the factory in Hamburg. Do you know what makes a truly exceptional pianist, Chen? Thomas hesitated. Technical skill and emotional understanding? Those are just the beginning, Harrington replied. What separates the good from the great is their relationship with the instrument. A great pianist doesn't play the piano, they become part of it. The piano is an extension of their soul. He looked directly at Thomas now. I don't sense that connection from you today. You're treating my piano like it's just wood and strings. Thomas felt a flicker of frustration. How could he explain that he connected deeply with every piano he played? That music had been his lifeline since childhood. That he practiced until his fingers ached because playing was the one thing that made him feel truly alive? I understand the instrument, Thomas said quietly. Sometimes it just takes me time to adjust to a new piano to understand its voice. Harrington raised an eyebrow. Time is something we don't have much of. Our season opener is in 3 weeks. He turned and walked a few steps away, then spun back with unexpected intensity. Don't touch my piano, poor guy. He shouted, his voice echoing around the empty hall. Not until you learn to respect what it can do. The sudden outburst made Thomas flinch. Several musicians who had been returning early froze in the doorway. Harrington lowered his voice again. For today you'll observe Lee play the Rachmaninoff. He's been with us for 12 years. Watch how he approaches the instrument. With that, Harrington returned to his podium as the rest of the orchestra filed back in. An older man with round glasses nodded politely to Thomas as he took the seat at the piano. Thomas moved to an empty chair at the side of the room, his cheeks burning with humiliation. He could feel curious glances and whispers following him as he sat down. His dream job was quickly becoming a nightmare. As the orchestra began the Rachmaninoff piece, Thomas watched Lee's hands move across the keys. The older pianist played with precision and confidence, clearly familiar with both the music and the instrument. But Thomas also noticed something that gave him hope. Lee's technique wasn't that different from his own. The difference was in the comfort level, the ease that came with familiarity. By the end of the rehearsal, Thomas had filled several pages of his notebook with observations. When Harrington dismissed the orchestra, many musicians hurried out, but a few approached Thomas with kind words of encouragement. Don't take it personally, said the silver-haired violinist, introducing herself as Helen. Anton speaks to all of us that way at some point. He pushed me to tears my first month. Does it get better? Thomas asked. Helen smiled. It gets different. You'll learn his language, and once he trusts you, there's no better conductor to play under. As Thomas packed up his things, he glanced back at the piano. The late morning sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating the instrument as if it were waiting for him. Harrington's words echoed in his mind. Don't touch my piano until you learn to respect it. I'll show you, Thomas whispered to the empty podium where the conductor had stood. I'll show you what I can do. What Thomas didn't say, what he hadn't told anyone at Westfield, was that the clock was ticking on his musical career. The growing darkness at the edges of his vision was a daily reminder that one day, perhaps soon, he would have to rely on his ears alone. As he walked out of the rehearsal hall, Thomas made a decision. He would return tonight after everyone had gone. He would get to know that piano in the only way that mattered, by playing it until his fingers knew every key. until he could find his way across its keyboard even in the dark. The janitor's surprised face peered around the door of the darkened rehearsal hall. "You're here late, aren't you?" Thomas looked up from the piano, his fingers pausing mid-phrase. He hadn't heard anyone come in, lost as he was in Rachmaninoff's complex rhythms. "Sorry," Thomas said, closing the sheet music. "I didn't realize the building was closing." The older man shook his head and stepped into the room, keys jangling at his belt. "Building doesn't close till midnight. Just not used to seeing musicians here past dinner." He walked closer, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his pocket. "You're the new guy, right? The one Harrington shouted at this morning?" Thomas winced. "News travels fast." "Name's Pete," the janitor said with a friendly smile. "Been keeping this place clean for 26 years. Seen plenty of musicians come and go. Heard plenty of Harringtons shouting, too. I'm Thomas." He extended his hand, and Pete shook it firmly. "And yes, I think everyone in the building heard him tell me not to touch his piano." Pete chuckled. "Yet here you are, touching it anyway." "I need to practice," Thomas said, looking down at the gleaming keys. "I can't afford to fall behind." The janitor studied him for a moment. "Tell you what, I usually clean this hall around 10. I'll save it for last in my rounds. Give you a couple extra hours each night." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You'd do that for me?"
"Music's meant to be played," Pete said simply.
"And nobody should practice with one eye on the clock." After Pete left, Thomas turned back to the piano. His eyes felt strained from hours of reading music in the dim light of the single lamp he'd turned on. The headache that had started earlier was getting worse, but he ignored it. He had to master this piece before tomorrow's rehearsal. He placed his hands on the keys again and began to play from memory, closing his eyes to let his fingers find their way. Sometimes, like tonight, it was easier to play without looking. The darkness behind his eyelids was familiar now, almost comforting. Thomas had first noticed the problems with his vision 3 years ago. The doctor had used words like degenerative and progressive, explaining that the condition would worsen gradually. "How gradually?" Thomas had asked. The doctor couldn't say for certain. What the doctor could say was that Thomas would eventually lose his sight completely. It might take 5 years, it might take 10. There was no cure, only management strategies. Thomas hadn't told anyone at the conservatory where he studied. He hadn't told his parents back home, not wanting to add to their worries. He certainly hadn't mentioned it during his audition for the Westfield Symphony. As his fingers danced across the keys, Thomas wondered how long he could keep his secret. How long before someone noticed him squinting at the music or bumping into things in low light? How long before he couldn't see the conductor's cues? The music swelled under his touch, the piano responding to his emotions. In moments like this, when it was just him and the instrument, Thomas felt truly free. Here, in the language of music, his failing eyes didn't matter. His ears and fingers could tell him everything he needed to know. It was past 11 when Thomas finally gathered his things to leave. He carefully returned the piano bench to its exact position and made sure no trace of his presence remained. As he walked out into the cool night air, exhaustion weighed on him, but so did a sense of accomplishment. Tonight he had made progress. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the rehearsal hall 30 minutes early, determined to avoid another scolding from Harrington. A few other musicians were already there, warming up or chatting in small groups. Helen, the silver-haired violinist, waved him over. "You survived day 1, she said with a smile. "That's something to celebrate." "Barely survived," Thomas admitted. "Anton's bark is worse than his bite," said a tall cellist standing beside Helen. "I'm David. By the way, usually worse," Helen corrected with a laugh. "Sometimes his bite is pretty bad, too." Before Thomas could respond, a hush fell over the room. Harrington had entered, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. His eyes swept across the musicians, landing briefly on Thomas before moving on without comment. "Rachmaninoff today," Harrington announced. "We'll run through the entire concerto. Lee, are you ready?" The older pianist nodded respectfully. "Chen," Harrington continued, "you'll observe again. Pay attention to the tempos in the third movement. They're tricky." Thomas took his seat at the side of the room, notebook ready. As the rehearsal began, he focused intently on Lee's performance, making notes about his interpretation and technique. The piece was magnificent, dramatic and emotional, with piano parts that demanded both technical precision and artistic sensitivity. During a short break, Thomas stepped out to use the restroom. On his way back, he overheard voices around the corner. Pushing Lee too hard, someone was saying. His arthritis is getting worse. You know Anton won't replace him, another voice responded. Not unless he absolutely has to. The new kid might be good enough. Harrington would never trust a newcomer with the Rachmaninoff for the gala. Thomas quietly backed away, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. But the conversation stayed with him as the rehearsal continued. He watched Lee more carefully now and noticed the slight stiffness in the older pianist's movements, the occasional grimace of discomfort when he stretched for the wider chords. That night, Thomas returned to the empty rehearsal hall. Pete nodded to him as they passed in the hallway, keeping his promise about cleaning schedule. Thomas sat at the piano thinking about what he'd overheard. Lee was struggling but hiding it well. Would Harrington notice? And if he did, what would happen? Thomas shook his head. It wasn't his problem to solve. His job now was to learn, to improve, to earn his place in the orchestra. He turned to the Rachmaninoff score, determined to master as much as he could. Hours passed as Thomas worked through the difficult passages. His vision blurred occasionally, forcing him to take breaks. During one such break, rubbing his tired eyes, he heard the door open. "You're still here." It was Harrington's voice, surprising and unwelcome. Thomas stood quickly. "I was just practicing, sir." "So I see," Harrington said, walking toward the piano, despite my explicit instruction not to touch it. "I thought you meant during rehearsal," Thomas said, then immediately regretted his words when he saw Harrington's expression darken. "You thought wrong." The conductor stopped a few feet away, studying Thomas with those piercing blue eyes. "What are you doing here at this hour anyway?" Thomas hesitated. "I'm trying to learn the Rachmaninoff, sir. In case I'm needed." Something flickered across Harrington's face, surprise perhaps, or curiosity. "You think you can master that concerto by practicing at night? It takes years to truly understand that piece." "I know," Thomas said, "but I have to start somewhere." Harrington was silent for a long moment, then gestured to the piano. "Play it for me." The third movement from the beginning. Thomas's heart raced. He hadn't mastered the third movement yet. It was technically the most demanding of the three. But refusing wasn't an option. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music was fast and complex, requiring absolute precision and control. Thomas struggled with some of the more difficult passages, his fingers stumbling over notes that he hadn't yet committed to muscle memory. But he kept going, pushing through his mistakes, trying to capture the spirit of the piece, if not its technical perfection. When he finished, he looked up to find Harrington watching him with an unreadable expression. "Your technique is uneven," the conductor said finally. "Your left hand lacks the strength it needs for those bass lines, and you missed at least a dozen notes in the middle section." Thomas nodded, accepting the criticism. "But," Harrington continued, surprising him, "there were moments when you found the heart of the music. That's not something I can teach." He walked closer to the piano, resting one hand on its polished surface. "Why did you close your eyes during the cadenza?" Thomas froze. He hadn't realized he'd done that. It was becoming an unconscious habit. "I sometimes play better when I'm not distracted by what I see," he said carefully. Harrington studied him, an unusual approach, but if it works, he shrugged. "Practice the left-hand part separately. Work on building strength and control. The fast passages need to be cleaner." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, still shocked that Harrington was giving him advice instead of another scolding. "And Chen," the conductor added as he turned to leave, "next time ask permission before using my piano after hours." For the next 2 weeks, Thomas fell into a grueling routine. Days were spent in rehearsals, observing Lee and learning the orchestra's repertoire. Nights were dedicated to private practice with Harrington's reluctant permission. Pete would bring Thomas coffee around midnight, insisting it was left over from the office, though Thomas suspected the kind janitor was making it fresh just for him. Thomas's eyesight continued to worsen. The headaches became more frequent. The blurry spells lasted longer. One evening, he nearly walked into a wall when the lights in the hallway suddenly seemed too dim to see by. He was adapting, though, memorizing the layout of the building, counting steps between locations, learning to rely more on his hearing and touch. No one seemed to notice his struggles, or if they did, they attributed his occasional clumsiness to fatigue or distraction. Thomas was careful to maintain the illusion of normalcy, especially around Harrington. who had taken to stopping by during Thomas's evening practice sessions to offer criticism and rarely praise. Then, just 3 days before the season opening gala, everything changed. Thomas arrived for morning rehearsal to find the orchestra in disarray. Musicians were gathered in small groups talking in hushed, concerned voices. Helen motioned him over as soon as he walked in. "Lee fell last night," she whispered. "Broke 2 fingers on his right hand. He won't be able to play for at least 6 weeks. Thomas felt a rush of sympathy for the older pianist, quickly followed by a wave of anxiety. "What about the concerto for the gala?" Helen shook her head. "No one knows. Harrington's been in his office all morning. The board members are panicking. They've sold out the hall on the promise of Rachmaninoff." Just then the rehearsal hall doors flew open, and Harrington strode in. His face was grim, his posture rigid with tension. "As you've all heard," he announced without preamble, "Lee has suffered an injury and cannot perform at the gala. This presents us with a significant problem." The room was utterly silent as everyone waited for his next words. "The Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 3 is the centerpiece of our program. Canceling it is not an option." Harrington's eyes swept across the room, finally landing on Thomas. "Chen, my office now." As Thomas followed the conductor out of the rehearsal hall, he could feel the stares of the entire orchestra on his back. His heart hammered in his chest. Was this his chance? Or was Harrington going to ask him to help find a replacement? Either way, Thomas knew his life was about to change. He just couldn't see how much. Harrington's office was smaller than Thomas had expected. No grand space with impressive views. Just a cluttered room with walls covered in framed concert programs and photographs of the conductor with various famous musicians. A worn leather chair sat behind a desk piled high with scores and music books. "Sit," Harrington said, pointing to the single chair facing his desk while he remained standing, too agitated to settle. Thomas sat, fighting to keep his expression neutral despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. Harrington paced back and forth in the limited space. "We have 3 days until the gala, 3 days to solve an impossible problem." He stopped suddenly and turned to Thomas. "How much of the Rachmaninoff have you learned?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I've been working on it every night. I know the first movement cold. The second is solid. The third still needs work, especially in the faster sections." "That's not good enough," Harrington said bluntly. "This concerto is a mountain. Professional pianists spend months preparing for it. You have 3 days. Are you offering me the solo?" Thomas asked carefully, hardly believing what he was hearing. Harrington's laugh had no humor in it. "Do I have a choice? Our other pianist is on maternity leave. The board is breathing down my neck about the sold-out performance. And you're here, practicing in the middle of the night like some kind of obsessed phantom." He leaned forward, planting both hands on the desk. "So yes, Chen, I'm offering you the solo. The question is, can you do it without embarrassing yourself in this orchestra?" Thomas should have felt elated. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. A featured solo with a prestigious orchestra, a chance to prove himself on a major stage. Instead, all he could think about was the blurry sheet music, the headaches, the increasing frequency of his vision problems. "There's something you should know," Thomas said quietly, the words sticking in his throat. This could end everything before it began, but he couldn't accept the role on false pretenses. "I have a medical condition." Harrington's expression shifted from impatience to concern. "What kind of condition?" "I'm losing my sight." The words hung in the air between them. "It's progressive. Eventually, I'll be completely blind. The doctors can't say exactly when." Harrington stared at him in silence, his face unreadable. Then he sank slowly into his chair, never taking his eyes off Thomas. "How bad is it now?" he asked finally. Thomas looked down at his hands. "I can still read music, but it's getting harder. I have good days and bad days. Sometimes my vision blurs without warning. I get headaches from eye strain." "And you didn't think this was worth mentioning during your audition?" Harrington's voice had a dangerous edge to it. "Would you have hired me if you knew?" Harrington didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I got into music because I loved it," Thomas continued. "When I found out about my condition, I had 2 choices. Give up the thing I love most in the world or work twice as hard to keep it. I chose to work harder." He looked directly at Harrington. "I memorize everything. I can play in the dark. I've been adapting for years. This isn't some small-town recital, Chen. This is Rachmaninoff with a professional orchestra. If you miss cues, I won't, Thomas interrupted. I've been developing systems, ways to compensate. I pay attention to sound cues from the orchestra. I can feel the conductor's energy, and I know this piece inside and out. Harrington stood up again and walked to the window, his back to Thomas. The silence stretched uncomfortably. The board would never approve, he said finally. If they knew about your condition, they'd insist on bringing in an outside pianist regardless of the cost. Thomas's heart sank. I understand. So they won't know, Harrington continued, turning to face him. Not yet. Not until after the gala. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. You still want me to play? I want you to prove you can play, Harrington corrected. Starting now. We have 3 days to prepare you for the most difficult piano concerto in the standard repertoire. 3 days to develop whatever systems you need to stay in sync with me and the orchestra. He checked his watch. The rehearsal hall is ours until noon. That gives us 2 hours now. You'll come to my home at 4 for another session. We'll work through dinner and into the night if necessary. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Harrington wasn't firing him, he was giving him a chance. Why? Thomas asked. Why take this risk? Harrington looked at him for a long moment. Because when you played for me that night, despite the mistakes, despite the technical issues, I heard something rare, something I haven't heard in years. A hint of a smile crossed his face. Also, I hate admitting defeat to the board. Thank you, Thomas said, emotion making his voice rough. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet, Harrington replied, already gathering his things. 3 days of working directly with me might make you wish I had fired you instead. The next 2 hours were the most intense of Thomas's musical life. Harrington was relentless, stopping him every few measures to correct, adjust, and refine. Nothing escaped his critical ear, not a single phrasing choice, dynamic shift, or pedaling technique. Again, Harrington would say after each attempt. Lighter touch here, more weight there. Listen to how the orchestra will respond to this phrase. By noon, Thomas's fingers were aching and his head was pounding from the strain of reading the score. As they gathered their things to leave, Harrington fixed him with a serious look. Go home, rest your eyes, eat something substantial. Be at this address at 4. He handed Thomas a slip of paper. And Chen, bring your medication, whatever helps with the headaches. When Thomas arrived at the conductor's home that afternoon, he was surprised by the modesty of the place. It was a small house in an older neighborhood, its front yard filled with untended plants and its paint slightly faded. The interior, however, told a different story. Every room Thomas could see was dominated by music. Shelves overflowing with records and CDs, framed sheet music on the walls, and in the living room, a beautiful baby grand piano. It's not the Steinway at the hall, Harrington said, noticing Thomas's appreciation of the instrument. But it has a good touch and clean action. For the next 6 hours they worked through the concerto movement by movement, section by section, sometimes note by note. Harrington made coffee that went cold as they worked. When Thomas's stomach growled audibly, the conductor disappeared into the kitchen and returned with sandwiches, which they ate while discussing the emotional arc of the second movement. The problem isn't your playing, Harrington said as the evening wore on. It's the coordination. We need a system for the critical transitions. They experimented with different approaches, subtle audio cues from the orchestra that Thomas could listen for, physical gestures from Harrington that would be clear enough for Thomas's limited vision to catch. What if we had a light? Thomas suggested suddenly. Something bright enough that I could see even on my worst days. You could have it on your podium. Harrington considered this. For the key transitions only. It wouldn't work for the entire piece, too many cues. But for the 4 or 5 critical moments, he nodded slowly. It could work. By the time Thomas left Harrington's house that night, it was past 11, and they had a plan. Not a perfect one, but workable. They would meet again early the next morning for Thomas's first rehearsal with the full orchestra. Thomas barely slept that night, his mind racing through the music, mentally practicing each difficult passage. When he finally drifted off near dawn, he dreamed of playing in complete darkness, the music flowing from his fingers like light. The next morning, the atmosphere in the rehearsal hall was tense with anticipation. Word had spread that Thomas would be taking Lee's place, and the other musicians watched him with a mixture of curiosity and concern as he took his seat at the piano. Harrington addressed the orchestra briefly. As you know, Lee is unable to perform at the gala. Chen will be taking his place for the Rachmaninoff. I expect everyone to give their absolute best as we prepare for Friday's performance. His eyes swept across the musicians. We have much to do and little time to do it. Let's begin. The rehearsal was rough. Despite all the preparation with Harrington, Thomas struggled to coordinate with the full orchestra. Tempos wavered, entrances were missed, and Harrington's frustration grew visibly with each mistake. During a break, Helen approached Thomas at the water fountain. "Don't let him get to you," she said quietly. "First rehearsals are always the hardest." "I'm not sure I can do this," Thomas admitted, keeping his voice low. "There's so much happening at once, and I can't always see." He caught himself, but it was too late. Helen's expression sharpened. "Can't always see what?" Thomas hesitated, then decided truth was his best option. "The score. The conductor. My vision isn't great. How not great? Bad enough to matter? Getting worse each month?" Helen was silent for a moment, processing this. "Does Anton know?" "Yes, he's the only one." She nodded slowly. "That explains the light on his podium. I was wondering about that." She studied his face. "You need help." "What I need is a miracle," Thomas said with a weak smile. "I can't offer that," Helen replied. "But I can offer this. The first violins sit directly across from the piano. If you need a visual cue and can't see Anton, look to me. I've played this piece for 20 years. I know every cue, every entrance. Why would you help me?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Helen's smile was kind. "Because 30 years ago I was the newcomer with something to prove. Because music matters more than ego. And because I've never seen Anton Harrington take a chance on anyone the way he's taking a chance on you." When they returned to their positions, Thomas felt a new determination. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had Harrington, however demanding he might be, and now he had Helen, offering an additional safety net. The remainder of the rehearsal went better. Not perfect, far from it, but better. The light system for critical transitions worked well enough, and Thomas found that looking to Helen during uncertain moments helped him stay grounded. By the end of the day, Harrington seemed cautiously satisfied. "Progress," he said as the orchestra packed up. "But not enough. My house again tonight, 7 o'clock. That evening, as they worked through the most problematic sections, Thomas noticed something had shifted in Harrington's approach. The criticism was still there, still sharp and precise, but it was no longer delivered with the same cutting edge. Instead, there was an intensity of focus that felt like genuine investment in Thomas's success. "The third movement cadenza," Harrington said late in the evening. "How do you see it?" "I don't," Thomas replied without thinking, then laughed at his own dark humor. "Sorry, bad joke." To his surprise, Harrington actually smiled. Gallows humor. Appropriate for Rachmaninoff, I suppose. He became serious again. "But really, what's your interpretation?" Thomas thought about it. "It's like standing at the edge of a cliff. The fear is part of the thrill. You either step back to safety, or you jump and trust that you can fly." Harrington nodded slowly. "Yes, that's exactly it." He closed the score in front of him. "Play it for me now, no music. Just play what you feel." Thomas closed his eyes and began. The cadenza flowed from his fingers. No longer a series of notes to be executed, but a story to be told. He could feel Harrington's presence, the conductor's focus as intense as a physical touch. When he finished, the silence in the room felt charged with emotion. "That," Harrington said quietly, "is what I heard in your audition recording. That is why I fought to bring you here." There was one more full rehearsal scheduled before the gala. As Thomas left Harrington's house that night, exhausted but hopeful, he knew that tomorrow would determine everything. If he could get through the final rehearsal successfully, there was a chance, just a chance, that he could pull off the performance of a lifetime. What he didn't know was that his body had other plans. As he climbed the steps to his small apartment, a wave of dizziness hit him so hard he had to grip the railing to avoid falling. When his vision cleared, there was a new darkness at the edges, a shadow that hadn't been there before. His condition was accelerating, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Thomas stood in his bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at his blurry reflection. The new eye drops the doctor had prescribed burned slightly, but he blinked through the discomfort. He had called for an emergency appointment first thing this morning after the frightening episode on the stairs last night. The progression is happening faster than we anticipated, the doctor had told him, her voice gentle but direct. The stress isn't helping. Neither is the lack of sleep. I have a performance tomorrow night, Thomas had explained. The most important of my life. The doctor's silence had spoken volumes before she finally offered, I can give you something for the pain and inflammation. It might help temporarily. But Thomas, you need to prepare yourself. These episodes will become more frequent. Now, as Thomas carefully counted out the pills he would need to get through today's final rehearsal, he forced himself to face the truth. This performance might not just be the most important of his life. It might be one of his last. His phone buzzed with a text from Harrington. Rehearsal moved to 10. Board members will be there. Thomas's stomach tightened. Board members meant pressure. Pressure meant stress. Stress meant his condition could worsen at the worst possible moment. When Thomas arrived at the rehearsal hall, he found Harrington in intense conversation with an elegant older woman whose perfectly styled gray hair and expensive clothing screamed authority. Several other well-dressed people stood nearby, watching the orchestra members take their places. Harrington broke away when he spotted Thomas. There you are. The board wants to observe the rehearsal. His voice was low and tense. They're nervous about the last-minute change in soloists. Should I be worried? Thomas asked quietly. Just play like you did last night, Harrington replied. Like you're standing at the edge of that cliff. The woman approached them, her assessing gaze taking in Thomas from head to toe. So this is our young savior, she said, extending her hand. Eleanor Woodward, board chairwoman. Thomas shook her hand, hoping his own wasn't trembling. Thomas Chen, it's an honor to meet you. Mr. Chen, I'll be direct. This gala is our biggest fundraising event of the year. Many of our most generous donors are attending specifically to hear Rachmaninoff's third. They were expecting Lee, who has an international reputation. They're getting you. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Convince me this isn't a mistake. Before Thomas could respond, Harrington stepped in. If you'll take your seats, we're about to begin. I think you'll find your concerns are unfounded. As the board members moved to chairs set up at the side of the hall, Harrington gave Thomas's shoulder a brief squeeze. Ignore them, he muttered. Focus on the music. Thomas took his place at the piano, fighting to control his breathing. The familiar headache was starting behind his eyes, and the sheet music already looked slightly blurred around the edges. He glanced toward Helen, who gave him an encouraging nod. Harrington raised his baton, and the orchestra launched into the opening of the concerto. The brooding clarinet melody set the mood, and then it was Thomas's turn to enter. His fingers found the keys, and for a few blissful minutes, everything went smoothly. The music flowed. His coordination with the orchestra was tight, and he could almost feel Harrington's approval in the energy of his conducting. Then, halfway through the first movement, it happened. Thomas's vision blurred suddenly, the sheet music becoming a meaningless smudge. Panic rose in his chest, but he fought it down. He had memorized this section. He could do this. His playing became tentative, his timing slightly off. Harrington's tempo felt faster than they had practiced, though Thomas couldn't tell if that was real or just his perception warped by anxiety. Helen caught his eye and gave a subtle nod on a key entrance, helping him find his way back into sync with the orchestra. But the damage was done. He could feel the board members watching, could sense their disappointment. When the movement ended, Harrington addressed the orchestra, but his eyes were on Thomas. Let's take 5 minutes. Everyone stay sharp. Thomas stood quickly, needing to escape the weight of all those stares. He hurried out of the hall, found a quiet corridor, and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes against the throbbing pain. He fumbled in his pocket for the pills the doctor had given him. Chen, Harrington's voice startled him. The conductor stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. What happened in there? Episode, Thomas said simply, swallowing the medication dry. Bad timing. Can you continue? Give me 2 minutes for these to kick in. Harrington checked his watch. 2 minutes. Not a second more. The board is already circling like vultures. When they returned to the hall, Eleanor Woodward intercepted them. Anton, a word? Her tone made it clear it wasn't a request. Thomas continued to the piano while Harrington was pulled aside. Through his peripheral vision, which was still relatively intact, he could see their conversation growing heated. Harrington gesturing emphatically, the chairwoman shaking her head. Finally, Harrington returned to the podium, his jaw tight with anger. From the beginning of the second movement, he announced, and this time, let's show our guests what this orchestra is capable of. The sweet, melancholy opening of the second movement began, and Thomas waited for his entrance. This was the most lyrical section of the concerto, the part where technical prowess mattered less than emotional sensitivity. As Thomas began to play, he made a decision. He closed his eyes completely. Let them think it was an artistic choice, a sign of deep emotion. In reality, it was his best chance at making it through. With his vision no longer fighting to focus, Thomas surrendered to his other senses. He listened intently to the orchestra, feeling the vibrations of the music through the piano. He sensed Harrington's energy, the subtle shifts in tempo and dynamics. And he let his fingers remember the hours upon hours of practice, the countless repetitions that had burned this music into his muscle memory. The result was transformation. His playing became fluid, expressive, alive with emotion. The orchestra responded, matching his intensity, supporting his interpretation. When the movement ended, there was a moment of profound silence before Harrington spoke. "Good," he said simply, but Thomas could hear the approval in his voice. Final movement from the beginning. The third movement was the most technically demanding with its fast passages and complex rhythms. Thomas kept his eyes closed through much of it, opening them only to glance at Helen for key transitions or to catch the light signal from Harrington's podium. It wasn't perfect. Thomas missed notes in the cadenza, and there was a tense moment when he almost came in too early after an orchestral passage. But there was also magic in the imperfection, a raw energy, a sense of risk and triumph that brought the music to life. When they finished the final crashing chords, Thomas was drenched in sweat, his breath coming in quick gasps. He waited, eyes open now but vision still blurry, for Harrington's verdict. "That will do for today," the conductor said, setting down his baton. "Everyone rest well tonight. Tomorrow we make music." As the orchestra began to pack up, Eleanor Woodward approached the piano, the other board members trailing behind her. "Interesting performance. Mr. Chen," she said, studying him with new interest. "Your technique in the first movement was concerning, but the emotional quality of the second and third movements was quite extraordinary." She tilted her head. "Tell me, why did you close your eyes?" Thomas met her gaze as steadily as his wavering vision would allow. "The music isn't in the page, Ms. Woodward, it's in the heart. Sometimes I see it more clearly with my eyes closed." She smiled, a genuine one this time. "Poetic, our donors will love that story." She turned to Harrington. "I still have concerns, Anton, but I'll withhold judgment until tomorrow night." After the board members left, Harrington approached Thomas, who was still sitting at the piano. "Too drained to move." "That was quick thinking," Harrington said. "The bit about seeing the music with your eyes closed." "It wasn't entirely untrue," Thomas replied. Harrington studied him. "How bad was the episode?" "Bad enough," Thomas rubbed his temples. "But the medication helped. I should be able to manage tomorrow if I'm careful." "You won't be careful," Harrington said bluntly. "Not if you play the way you just played the second and third movements. That kind of playing demands everything you have." "What choice do I have?" Thomas asked. Harrington was silent for a long moment. "We adapt," he said finally. "I want you at my house at 3 this afternoon. No piano practice. We're going to work on a different kind of preparation." Thomas was intrigued but too exhausted to ask questions. He nodded and slowly gathered his things. As promised, there was no piano at that afternoon session. Instead, Harrington had cleared the furniture from his living room and placed 2 chairs facing each other. "Sit," he instructed when Thomas arrived. "Close your eyes." Thomas did as he was told, curious but apprehensive. "Now I'm going to conduct the first movement. No orchestra, no piano. Just my movements. I want you to feel the tempo, sense the dynamics without seeing or hearing anything." "How?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. "By developing your other senses," Harrington explained. "The subtle sounds of my breathing, the rustle of clothing as I move, the vibration in the floor, the energy in the room." It seemed impossible, but Thomas tried. For hours they worked this way, Harrington conducting silently, Thomas trying to follow the invisible music. Sometimes Harrington would suddenly clap or tap his foot at a critical transition point, training Thomas to respond to audio cues. "Again," Harrington would say after each attempt. "Feel it, don't see it." By the end of the session, Thomas was mentally exhausted but strangely calm. Something had shifted in his understanding of the music and his relationship to it. The notes were no longer just on the page. They lived in his body, in his breath, in his bones. "Tomorrow," Harrington said as Thomas prepared to leave. "Wear this." He handed Thomas a small object. Thomas examined it. "A lapel pin?" "It was given to me by my teacher, who received it from his teacher. A small tradition among a certain circle of musicians." Harrington's voice held an emotion Thomas couldn't quite identify. "For luck." Thomas was touched by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you. I'll take good care of it." "See that you do," Harrington replied, his usual gruffness returning. "I expect it back after the performance." That night, Thomas slept better than he had in weeks, the exhaustion finally overcoming his anxiety. He dreamed of playing in a vast darkness, the music visible as streams of light flowing from his fingers. Morning came, and with it, the day of the gala. Thomas woke feeling rested but immediately aware of his vision. The darkness at the edges had spread, leaving him with a narrowed field of view like looking through a tunnel. He took his medication and dressed carefully, making sure Harrington's pin was securely fastened to his lapel. A text arrived from Helen. "We believe in you. We'll be with you every note." Thomas smiled at the message, grateful for her support. Then a second text came, this one from Harrington. "Remember, music isn't just what we hear. It's what we feel." As Thomas stepped outside into the bright morning light, he felt a curious mix of fear and peace. Tonight would be the most challenging performance of his life. His vision might fail him completely. He might miss cues, play wrong notes, lose his place in the score, but something else might happen too. Something extraordinary. Standing on the edge of that cliff, he might just discover he could fly. The concert hall buzzed with anticipation. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns filled the seats, programs rustling as they pointed out names and pieces to one another. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off polished instruments as orchestra members took their places on stage. Backstage, Thomas sat alone in a small dressing room, his hands resting palm down on his knees. He wore a new suit, his first proper tuxedo rushed from the tailor just that morning. Harrington's pin gleamed on his lapel. His eyes were closed as he breathed deeply, trying to center himself in the way Harrington had taught him. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. "5 minutes, Mr. Chen," called the stage manager. "Thank you," Thomas responded, his voice steadier than he felt. When he opened his eyes, the world had narrowed even further. The tunnel of his vision had contracted, leaving only a small circle of clarity surrounded by shadow. The doctor had warned him that stress could accelerate his symptoms. She'd been right. Another knock, this one more familiar. 3 short taps followed by 2 longer ones. Helen's signal. Thomas opened the door to find the violinist waiting, already dressed in the orchestra's formal concert attire. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. Thomas tried to smile. "I've been better," Helen's gaze was knowing.
Your eyes?
"Pretty bad," he admitted. "But I took the medication. I'm ready." She reached out and straightened his bow tie. "Everyone out there is talking about the mysterious last-minute replacement pianist. Half of them think you're some kind of prodigy being kept secret for dramatic effect." That made Thomas laugh despite his nerves. If only they knew. "Maybe they should," Helen said, suddenly serious. "Your story, Thomas, it's powerful. What you're doing tonight is remarkable." Thomas shook his head. "Tonight isn't about my story. It's about the music." Helen smiled at that. "You sound like Anton." She checked her watch. "Time to go? Remember, first violin's directly across from you. I won't let you get lost." Thomas followed her through the backstage area, navigating by staying close to her elbow, grateful that the hallway was relatively empty. As they approached the wings, Harrington appeared, imposing in his formal conductor's attire. "Chen," he said with a nod. "A word?" Helen squeezed Thomas's arm and continued on to join the orchestra. Harrington led Thomas to a quiet corner. "How's your vision?" "Deteriorating," Thomas said honestly. "But I can still see the light on your podium. And Helen will help with cues." Harrington studied him intently. "Are you afraid?" The question caught Thomas off guard. "Terrified," he admitted. "Good," Harrington said. "Fear can be useful. It sharpens our senses, makes us more alive." He paused. "But don't let it control you. Remember what we practiced yesterday. Feel the music, don't just play it." Thomas nodded, taking another deep breath. One more thing, Harrington said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Whatever happens out there tonight, you've already won my respect. That doesn't come easily. Before Thomas could respond, the stage manager approached. Places, please. The walk onto the stage was a blur of bright lights and applause. Thomas followed the path he'd memorized during rehearsals, counting steps until he reached the piano. He adjusted the bench carefully, testing its position, making sure everything felt right. Across the stage, he could just make out Helen's encouraging smile. Harrington took his place at the podium, acknowledged the concertmaster with a bow, then turned to the audience to announce a change in the program. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an injury, Li Weijian will not be performing tonight. In his place, we are pleased to present a young pianist making his debut with our orchestra. Please welcome Thomas Chen. The applause was polite but reserved. Thomas could sense the audience's disappointment and skepticism. He had something to prove. Harrington turned to face the orchestra, made brief eye contact with Thomas, and raised his baton. The first clarinet began the haunting opening theme, and Thomas focused on the sound, letting it wash over him. Then came his cue. He placed his hands on the keyboard and began to play. The first few minutes were tentative as Thomas found his way. His narrow vision made it hard to see the full keyboard, so he relied on touch and memory, feeling the geography of the piano beneath his fingers. The music felt slightly distant, as though he were listening to someone else play. Then came the first major transition, where he'd struggled in rehearsal. Thomas glanced up to see the light on Harrington's podium flash once, twice, giving him the tempo. Helen nodded in perfect sync with the light. Thomas took the cue and moved into the next section smoothly. Something shifted then. The distance collapsed, and suddenly Thomas was fully present in the music. His fingers found the keys with increasing confidence, and the piano began to sing under his touch. The orchestra responded to his energy, matching his phrasing, supporting his interpretation. The first movement built to its conclusion, and as the final notes faded, Thomas could hear a change in the audience. The rustle of programs had stopped, replaced by an attentive silence. The second movement began, its wistful melody unfolding like a secret being shared. Thomas closed his eyes completely, surrendering to the darkness that was becoming so familiar. Without the strain of trying to see, he felt his other senses heighten. He could hear nuances in the orchestra he'd never noticed before. The subtle breath of the flutist before an entrance, the rich overtones of the cellos, the precise attack of the percussion. His playing became more fluid, more expressive. The piano no longer felt like an instrument separate from himself, but an extension of his body, his voice. The notes on the page that he could no longer see had become a living thing inside him. As the movement ended, Thomas could feel the audience leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the emotional journey he was creating. The silence that followed was deeper, charged with anticipation. Then came the third movement with its technical challenges and breakneck tempos. This was where Thomas had worried he would falter, where his limited vision might betray him. But as he launched into the opening phrases, something unexpected happened. In the darkness behind his closed eyelids, Thomas began to see the music, not as notes on a page, but as patterns of light and color. Each chord had a shape, each phrase a direction. The architecture of the piece revealed itself to him in a way he'd never experienced before. His fingers flew across the keys, finding impossible passages with perfect accuracy. He felt Harrington's surprise and delight through the energy of his conducting, sensed the orchestra's excitement as they followed his lead. When he reached the cadenza, that moment of standing at the cliff's edge, Thomas didn't hesitate. He jumped, surrendering completely to the music flowing through him. Time seemed to slow, each note ringing with crystalline clarity despite the rapid tempo. His body knew exactly what to do without conscious direction. Years of practice and passion finding their ultimate expression. As the orchestra rejoined him for the final section, Thomas felt a curious sense of peace. Whatever happened to his sight in the coming months or years, he had discovered something profound tonight. That music lived in a place beyond vision, in a realm he could always access no matter how dark his world became. The concerto built toward its thunderous conclusion, orchestra and piano locked in perfect synchrony. Thomas poured every ounce of emotion and energy into the final phrases, and when the last crashing chord sounded, he felt as though something had broken open inside him, not in a painful way, but as if a door had been unlocked to a part of himself he hadn't known existed. For 3 heartbeats after the final note, there was absolute silence in the concert hall. Thomas sat motionless at the piano, hands still hovering over the keys, eyes closed, waiting. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building rapidly into a roar. Thomas opened his eyes to a blur of movement as the audience rose to their feet. The sound was overwhelming, washing over him in waves. He stood somewhat unsteadily and bowed. As he straightened, he felt a presence beside him. Harrington had left the podium to join him at the piano. The conductor extended his hand, and when Thomas took it, he was pulled into a brief, fierce embrace. "That wasn't playing," Harrington said, his voice rough with emotion, loud enough for only Thomas to hear. "That was sorcery." Thomas laughed, tears stinging his eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude. "I had a good teacher." Harrington guided him to the front of the stage for another bow. The applause continued unabated. In the front row, Thomas could just make out Eleanor Woodward standing with the other board members, all applauding enthusiastically. Directly across from the piano, Helen and the string section were tapping their bows against their music stands, a musician's highest form of approval. As he took a final bow and made his way off stage, Thomas knew that regardless of what happened with his sight, tonight had changed everything. He had proven something essential, not just to Harrington or the board or the audience, but to himself. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas's vision continued to deteriorate. By the following spring, he could see only vague shapes and changes in light. But his career didn't end as he had feared. Instead, it transformed. Harrington worked with him to develop new ways of performing, adapting the traditional relationship between conductor and soloist. Thomas became known for his unique approach, playing with his eyes closed, seeming to commune with the music in a way that captivated audiences. Critics wrote about the blind pianist who played like a sorcerer, whose performances transcended the merely technical to touch something profound. Students with visual impairments sought him out as a teacher and inspiration. The pin that Harrington had loaned him for luck became a permanent gift, a symbol of the bond that had formed between them. And whenever Thomas felt uncertain or afraid, he remembered that night, standing at the edge of the cliff, eyes closed, discovering that he could indeed fly. One evening, after a particularly successful concert, a young reporter asked Thomas if he regretted anything about his condition, if he ever wished he could see the music again. Thomas smiled and shook his head. "I don't see the music," he said. "I feel it. And sometimes to truly understand something beautiful you have to close your eyes."